Your text does a really good job of covering the basics of the various early forms of art, walking us through the prehistoric all the way up to the Middle Ages. But it also does go through things fairly quickly, condensing it down into a pretty minimal perspective on each of these periods. I wanted to use this opportunity to give you a little bit more information and draw your attention to some of the really important facets of each of these different styles of art and periods of art. So we'll be walking through essentially in the same order that your textbook goes through, but looking a little more closely at some additional images that are not within the textbook. So one of the first things your text looks at are these prehistoric female figures. So in particular, your book uses the Venus of Willendorf, which is pictured here on the left. And this was found in Austria. It dates back to about 24,000 BCE. And stylistically, we are fairly confident that it has to do with fertility. We see the enhanced female figure with large hips, large breasts. There isn't really a lot of focus on the face itself, but it is clearly a feminine figure. And similar types of forms have been found throughout Europe, especially in the Germanic regions and what is now sort of Eastern Europe. So, for example, on the right, you see the woman from Dolní Věstonice, which was found in the Czech Republic, dating back to about 23,000 BCE. Very similar, but clearly a different style of perspective on this particular image. So, a more elongated figure overall, a longer head and neck. The breasts, instead of being very large, are a little bit longer. Similarly wide hips, though. And so there is definitely a correlation here. So similar types of figures have been found throughout Europe. And we again, estimate that this has to do with a need for fertility at this time. One of the other really common aspects of prehistoric art are the various cave formations that have been found throughout places in France and Germany and Spain. The Chauvet Caves in particular is one of the largest and most complete cave complexes. And there are a lot of different styles of images here. So on the map, you can see the entrance all the way down here, and it goes for many, many miles underground. Most of it is off limits today. It's not very safe, and it would destroy the actual preservation of the images to have too many people in there breathing the air and disrupting the dust. But when it was first discovered back in the early part of the 20th century, there wasn't really as much of an understanding of that, so a lot of people did explore it. There are a lot of images that show animals within the caves, and in particular, we see them in motion. So there is a suspicion that this has to do with herds, the types of herds that would have been available for hunting at this time. So here in the Hall of Bulls, you can see a variety of them, and it looks like they're in motion, that they are somehow traveling. There are suspicions, but not confirmed, that these have to do with hunting patterns, that they would be able to help remember what herds would be available at different times of year. But we also see things like the rhinoceros on the left here. And if you look at the top rhinoceros, there are these multiple outlines of the same animal, which we suspect means motion. The same is true of the mammoth down below. So you can see the woolly mammoth available. So again, these may or may not have been things that the prehistoric peoples of this region had access to. We don't really have evidence of rhinoceros in France, but it is possible that either there were at the time, or else these nomadic peoples might have gone to a region where there were rhinoceros and then recorded it here in the caves. There are also a wide number of megalithic stone formations all throughout the UK, Ireland, and northern France. This map, which is available online from megalithic.co.uk, shows all of the megalithic stone formations in the UK. So you can see a lot of them in what is Wales and Scotland, quite a few of them in Ireland, but also quite a few throughout England itself. The one your textbook focuses on and best known is the Stonehenge formation in Salisbury Plain, England. I'm just going to flip forward to a map here. This shows what it probably looked like when it was originally constructed, that there would have been multiple rings of stones with an altar in the center. We still don't really have a great understanding of exactly why this was created or why any of these would have been made, although we do know that they line up with various solstices, so it may have been for some kind of ritual, although what kind actually we don't really know. So we move on to the Near East. your book focuses on the ziggurat formations, which were really centers of worship for the Near Eastern peoples. The Nana ziggurat at Ur is really the best preserved of all of these. And in it you can see there's a staircase running up either side, as well as the front. You can see it better in this drawing down below. And there really wasn't much happening on the inside in this lowest level. There were some rooms inside on the second level, and then a temple all the way at the top. And the only people really allowed to worship there would have been priests and priestesses. The lay people would not have been allowed on these ziggurats. But the theory behind them was that the higher up they went, the closer to the gods a person became, and the more likely their prayers were to be heard. So they would put the altar right at the top to allow them the best chance of being heard. They used the step formation, which we again see in other cultures, but in the Near Eastern cultures, it is specific to worship. There's also a highly stylized figurative representation in this part of the world, in this Near Eastern Mesopotamian culture. Size, in particular, has a lot of significance in this art. So here we're looking at what's called the stele, which essentially means a rounded stone with carvings on it, of Naram Sin, who was one of the major leaders. So we see Naram Sin here, and we see this important mountain next to him. And above it, we see what looks like a sun, and this is actually a representation of a god, the sun god. So we see Naram Sin walking over his enemies. We see some of them dead down below. We see his soldiers supporting him, and we see him sort of marching up towards the godliness. So an image like this would have been used to essentially confirm his power, his importance, and his near godliness, which is really a goal of a lot of kings at this time, is to be seen as near or actual gods. You also see, this is called a relief sculpture because it's carved out of a flat surface. So you see this kind of composite image where the hips are pushed forward while we see also the full upper torso. And it's kind of an unrealistic perspective, but they did not really have a great understanding of how the human figure could be actually represented. So this is really the best that they could do. This is another stele, this one called the Stele of Hammurabi. Hammurabi you may have heard of. He's famous for writing Hammurabi's Code, which is actually represented here down below on the stele. So up above we have Hammurabi. He is seated, Hammurabi is on the right, standing before Shamash, the sun god. Shamash, if he stood up, would clearly be larger than Hammurabi. But by having Shamash seated, we put Hammurabi at essentially the same level as the god, which is not unintentional. In this image, we basically see Hammurabi being elevated to the same level as a god. We again see really important aspects of the basic style of Near Eastern art. It's very geometric. If you look at Shamash's hat and the bottom of his robe, they both look like the step pyramids, the ziggurats. And then we have this very linear stylized beard, which you'll see in a lot of Near Eastern art from the time. If we move on to ancient Egypt, we see the alternative to the Near Eastern ziggurat with the Egyptian pyramid. These were not used for worship. They were used exclusively for burial, and specifically burial of kings. Lay people, slaves, would certainly not have been buried in a pyramid. Although in this largest and best known, the pyramids at Giza, you actually will see in the complex surrounding it that there are cemeteries. These would be cemeteries for the people who died in construction or else in dedication to the lives of the kings. So there are three primary pyramids at Giza. You have Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. Khufu is the one who actually commissioned this complex. It was continued by Khafra, and then Menkaure had it completed. So he actually has the smallest of the three temples or pyramids. But then he also has the pyramids of the queens, which are these smaller ones you see in front, right nearby. It would have been the queens for each of the three kings. There was also a temple nearby to each of the actual pyramids. So the pyramid with the Great Sphinx was Khafra's. So you actually will see a sphinx right here at the front. That's where the Great Sphinx sits. And the temple that would have been accessible to disciples of the kings would have been available up here. Very few people would have actually followed the causeways up into the pyramids, and those would have essentially been closed off once the kings were buried in there. If you look in this drawing here, you can actually see the interior of one of these pyramids. So there would have been one large gallery with some smaller rooms, one room specifically for the king. There would have been air shafts to allow people to work on these while they were being built, a subterranean passage, usually somewhere for the queen, and there would be various treasures buried throughout the pyramids with the king and queen. Most of these have been raided as of today. They were sealed for a very long time, but over the millennia, they have been raided, and so a lot of the materials that used to be in these pyramids we see in museums today. The pyramids were also built almost exclusively by slave labor. They are a huge feat in the way they are constructed, and if I go back to this image, you can see there's sort of two layers. This was the sort of rougher underlayer that actually looks a little bit more like the step pyramids. And then they would have put a smoother outer layer on top to actually make it a smooth four-sided pyramid rather than the steps all the way around. The figure in ancient Egypt is, for the most part, not so dissimilar from the figure in ancient Near East. So your book uses a different example of a king and queen together, but this version of Menkore and his queen, or her name is Khamene'tep, is almost the same as the one in your textbook. So we see the king, Menkore, sort of rigidly standing with his hands by his side, very upright, one leg forward to indicate movement, but really no sense of realism there. He does not look like he's actually able to stand that way. And in fact, behind them, you see this stone that is there specifically to help the figure stand upright. The king is also pretty nondescript. He's highly muscular and idealized. This is not probably Menkore's actual face. And if you notice, the face of his wife is almost the same face, just slightly softer. The queen is also an idealized figure. She has sort of this perfect female form. It emphasizes the aspects of reproduction that are available for her. And again, stands pretty rigidly. There is one period of exception in ancient Roman art. Ancient Egyptian, struggling to speak here. Ancient Egyptian art, and that is the Amarna period. So on the left here, you see the figure of Akhenaten, who was the king during this Amarna period. And he is one of thousands of kings who actually valued realism in his art. So primarily, the Egyptian sculpture was supposed to look idealized, essentially to reiterate that connection to being a god, that a king was a god. And Akhenaten kind of threw that off. He believed only in one god, the sun god. And he said, if there is only one god, I cannot also be a god, so I must be a man. And he would have himself represented looking much more realistically. Now, if you think he looks a little bit odd, that is actually because he is recorded to have been a hermaphrodite. He had a very feminine figure, but again, wanted to be represented as he truly was. So in your textbook, they show the image of Nefertiti. Nefertiti was his wife. There are also images of his mother, who is the Queen T. All of these images would be highly realistic in comparison to the image of Menkore and his queen. As I said before, there is also a sort of perception of what the king, for the most part in Egypt, needs to look like. There is one particular queen who rises up and rules Egypt for quite some time. Her name is Hatshepsut. And all of the images of Hatshepsut make her look like a man. And this is essentially because there is this particular image of the king, and it does not matter who the person actually is. Their images have to be made to look like the king, because that image carries the attributes needed for a king. So we see here in Hatshepsut's image that she is with a beard. She looks masculine. She does not look like a woman at all. And it is only through recordings and writings that we actually know that this is the queen and not the king. I'm going to pause here and pick up in the second video.